Let's pick up that story about how Andy Burnham wants to boost government spending through more borrowing in an effort to get growth going. Now, the move, which could raise more than £9 billion a year for spending by 2031, would exploit a loophole in the fiscal rules, which allows the government to count spending on infrastructure or equity in company as assets, and that can be offset against the cost of borrowing, therefore not breaking the manifesto rules. So is this a wise idea that could make a difference, or is this just trying to dodge around the difficult decision that it's more borrowing? Let's get the view of James Nation. He's Managing Director at Forefront Advisors and was a Senior Advisor to Rishi Sunak in the Treasury and in Downing Street. Hello, James. Welcome to Times Radio.
Hi, Seb. Great to be with you.
So let's start off with this proposed loophole on how to raise this £9 billion as rebranding infrastructure or equity as assets. Now, during your time in number 10 and number 11 Downing Street, I'm sure you examined all these different ruses and ways to get around it. What do you make of this suggestion?
Well, the first thing to say, Seb, is that borrowing is borrowing. So we'll come on to the flexibilities, but you are still issuing money, right? And you still need to go to the markets for any additional funding. So that's kind of point one. We talk about these flexibilities and whether they count against the fiscal rules, but what the markets are looking at is issuance. How much does the UK government want to borrow? And then you mentioned it up top, but one of the first things Rachel Reeves did when she came into power as Chancellor is she actually changed the debt target. She changed our measurement of debt in the fiscal rules. She moved to something called public sector net financial liabilities, or PSNUFL, for those of you who like somewhat catchy acronyms. And that, under the government's fiscal rules, has to fall in the third year of the OBR forecast. But as you said, you can, if you have a loan that has a new asset created that cancels out a liability, that can count as neutral under the fiscal rules, which is what we're talking about here. Basically, John Healey and Andy Burnham have asked the exam question, can we find ways to use these flexibilities to achieve what we want to achieve on more capital spending in things like housing and transport without having to change the fiscal rules? Now, I'm quite sceptical here, Seb, I've got to say. I know there have been some figures bandied around this morning. Resolution Foundation, a well-respected think tank, have done a report where they estimate around about 9 billion could be freed up here per annum. But I just think, let's go back to Rachel Reeves very quickly. If this flexibility or these flexibilities were a free lunch, do we not think she would have maxed them out, having made that change to the fiscal rules? When she did her spending review and freed up all this additional room for capital, there was only 9 billion allocated to these loans or flexibilities, but over a number of years, not per annum. And there are a couple very quick reasons for that. One, when you borrow more, you pay the debt interest, which does count against the government's main fiscal rule, the headroom that everyone was fixated on last year. And second, these loans or FTs, they're quite cute. They don't necessarily help in what I would call traditional areas of government spending, where you need hard grant, hard cash, if we think about defence or council housing as well. So there are just some limitations on the idea here, Seb.
And I think Rachel Reeves, James, did look at this, and she talked about during her time as Chancellor about whether there was that flexibility in terms of how certain things are branded. But I agree with you, it is actually more about borrowing. And ever since Andy Burnham's become Prime Minister, there was all this question about what the bond markets would make of this, because they've been quite edgy about whether the UK's massive debt pile is going to become unsustainable. Now, there hasn't really been any kind of market reaction to this so far this morning. You know, do you think those who are sort of owning the UK's debt, those bond markets that I mentioned, they would look at this and say, OK, we're going to wear this? Or do you think they might say, well, actually, this is going to tip us into difficult territory?
So I think you have to break it down, Seb. So I think the announcements that you talked about at the start of Burnham's premiership, if we take them individually, in terms of overall government, and departmental spend, not that significant. I've seen announcements like this before, a treasury, or rather an announcement that a bus cap freeze will be extended. And ultimately, that
I feel like you might have been at the treasury when that happened, James. You have
Indeed,
direct knowledge of these things.
Dare I say the £2 bus fare cap was very much a Rishi Sunak policy. But anyway, I'm being cheeky there. The point is, those announcements in isolation, Seb, you can find the funding for them. So in and of itself, I don't think those initial announcements were cause for alarm. Where I think there was a problem initially was Andy Burnham's comments on big tax changes. If you remember what he was saying to lobby journalists on, the personal tax allowance, or on taking pensioners out of fiscal drag, really leaning into some quite big and expensive tax changes that he's just not going to be able to do, because, if anything, taxes are going to need to go up to try and avoid some planned cuts to unprotected departments and some other areas that he's going to want to fund as well. So it's kind of that ability for the Prime Minister to sort of lean into these policies with a price tag that I think led people to be a little bit uncertain. And then, if I may, just on this area of the fiscal rules flexibilities, look, I think what Team Burnham and some economists around Team Burnham would say is we have had a problem in this country about low public sector investment when it comes to capital spending. And actually, long-term planned investment in transport, for example, can generate returns. And if you set out that vision, then what markets are ultimately looking for is, hang on, in the medium term, in years to come, has the UK actually got a plan to grow or not? And they would hope to reassure in that way. But I think the issue with today's story, if I'll just come back to my last answer, is, can these flexibilities really get enough funding for what Andy Burnham and John Healey want to do? I think if they are going materially higher than 9 billion per annum, and if they judge that these flexibilities are limited and attempted still to try and borrow more, well, then I think there will be a price to pay for that.
Now, you mentioned, James, of course, the question about debt. And when you were working with Rishi Sunak, the UK's net national debt soared. It surpassed 2.6 trillion, exceeding that critical marker of 100% of GDP for the first time since 1961. So obviously Rachel Reeves and now John Healey are dealing with this, but aren't they just sort of inheriting a problem that was created while you were in government?
Look, undeniably, during COVID, we did have to step in with some massive interventions, which, your listeners will remember, particularly when we look at the furlough scheme. None of that, by the way, at the time was opposed by any opposition politician that I can recall.
Do you regret any of that when you look back to it? That obviously it was, £400 billion was spent during the pandemic, and we know there was a fair amount of fraud within that. But do you think it was still the right decision to spend all that money?
Look, hindsight's a wonderful thing. And when you're moving really quickly, Seb, as we were during the pandemic, you just know that you're going to be implementing schemes that, just cannot have the kind of guardrails that you would normally expect in some circumstances. So, of course, when you look at some figures that the NAO and others have highlighted, there's regret there. But at the time, we were having to move so quickly to stand up business support schemes overnight, to make various forms of equipment available, to ensure that people weren't losing their jobs in what was a very vulnerable time. And if I may, I was working for Rishi as well when he started to take some very difficult decisions on the tax side, when we think about the decision to put up corporation tax, for instance, even on thresholds, which obviously is widely criticised now. So we were starting towards the tail end of that tenure, particularly when I think Jeremy Hunt deserves a lot of credit, but then Rishi and Downing Street as well, to confront the kind of debt and deficit implications of what had been done during the pandemic. But for sure, there are consequences, and it's left us with a challenging set of public finances that reflect a reality now that just needs to be addressed by the current set of politicians.
Well, finally, James, let's say you'd put your blue rosette down and put a red rose in your hair, and you were sitting in Downing Street beside Andy Burnham, and he's looking at all this. He wants to make these spending announcements, solve some of those big problems like social care. What would be your advice to him? Should he not just break the manifesto commitment, say, and raise the basic rate of income tax by 2p? Wouldn't that just be cleaner? Give him the money that he needs to spend on that stuff, as opposed to all this stuff of tinkering around the edges.
Yeah, well, I should say I wear no rosette these days, Seb. But if I was in the room with him, the thing that I would just say is, careful about being too cute. right? Careful about, trying to say, oh, this is technically within the spirit of the fiscal rules. It's like I said up top, more borrowing is more borrowing. You are much better to try and make an argument for what you're looking to do. And I think that's where his 10-year plan, in addition to the budget, will be very interesting. I certainly would not be advising him to put up the basic rate of income tax. We saw what happened last year when Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer flirted with that. I think, for a Labour government to do that would be an invitation for the opposition parties to capitalise. So I think, if it were me ahead of this budget, I would just be saying, let's communicate very clearly what you're actually trying to achieve. Make an argument for what you're trying to achieve. If we want to do more capital spending, well, let's set out why that is a good thing. What kind of projects is that going to be invested in? How is working with mayors going to lead to better decisions? And then, yes, we have to be cautious. We have to be responsible because of the market reality. We can't ignore what the Treasury are telling us. But sometimes, and I love this stuff, you can probably tell, I hope, this kind of fiscal nerdery.
Yeah.
I think sometimes you get lost in that without, yes, acknowledging constraints, but also thinking about the story you really want to try and tell to sell what you want to do.
Well, that was James Nation, who's managing director at the borrowing firm Forefront and a former advisor to Rishi Sunak. And when Andy Burnham comes back from his holiday, maybe we'll have a bit more of that storytelling.